Welcome to Map Crow, the RPG art show. My name is Kyle, and today we're asking the big questions. What are monsters even for? So we just had our big kickoff meeting to begin work on Monstrous, which collects all the monsters I've been designing on this channel for use in your role-playing game. There's a link in the description below. Anyways, at this meeting, I kind of had to explain what monsters are even for and where I think they are not being served well in the community. First, let's look at this through the lens of game design. Bernard Suits, as I often remind my students and viewers of this channel, describes games as a voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. So in the case of a game like Dungeons and Dragons, monsters make excellent obstacles. They keep the heroes from progressing to the end of their story or quest unimpeded. Monsters are these tests, these obstacles, these gates, these pop quizzes. Have you been paying attention? Do you know what to do? Have you chosen the proper abilities? And do you know when and how to use them? I don't think that there's anything particularly revelatory or surprising about this view on what monsters are doing in Dungeons and Dragons, but Dungeons and Dragons is not simply its mechanics. It is not an overly elaborate game of craps. It has a rich narrative context. So the question then turns to, what are monsters in stories for? And what are stories themselves for? One of my favorite authors, Kurt Vonnegut, wrote some tips for writing short stories in the introduction to his short story collection, Bagumbo Snuffbox. His number one tip is to use the time of a total stranger in such a way that he or she will not feel the time was wasted. And if we skip down to tip number 6, it says, be a sadist. No matter how sweet or innocent your lead characters, make awful things happen to them in order that the reader may see what they are made of. So with these two tips, we can construct a kind of temporary definition, a purpose for stories. Stories seem to be something that at least has the illusion of being a productive use of one's time, and that is tied to seeing the revelation of characters. To see what characters are made of is something that is useful and worthwhile. Or to put it another way, stories about fake made-up people can touch our real hearts, and that is important or useful in some way. And we know that stories have an artfulness to them. They have a poetry. It is more than just a dry, bulleted list of fake things that happened to made-up people. There is a romance, a dance that stories do to convey their points. We use techniques, methods, themes, tropes, imagery, metaphor to relate these stories, not only to entertain and delight, but also to learn and share things that we think are important to know in some way. We use stories to communicate values, to instill lessons, to warn people what to avoid. And we constantly elaborate on these and change them so that we can build new metaphors to make more nuanced and interesting points. But basically, we are trying to celebrate the heroes of life and villainize the evils. At least this is the trend in genre fiction. So if monsters are one of these techniques, if monsters are one of these metaphors that we deploy in stories, what are they doing there? And in 1936, J.R.R. Tolkien delivered a paper called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. And he makes an argument about just this. Now, most of the article is really about him kind of summarizing the scholarship of Beowulf and saying that it is woefully deficient of interacting with the narrative and poetic nature of Beowulf in favor of the historicity of place names and surnames there within. But he does make a couple of points in this essay that I think are well worth repeating when thinking about what monsters are doing in Dungeons and Dragons. About halfway through the essay, he starts unpacking the intermingling of Christian imagery and themes with the pagan roots of Beowulf. He says, The monsters had been the foes of the gods, the captains of men, and within time, the monsters would win. In the heroic siege and the last defeat, men and gods alike had been imagined in the same host. Now the heroic figures, the men of old, remained and still fought until defeat. For the monsters do not depart, whether the gods go or come. A Christian was, and is, still like his forefathers, a mortal, hemmed in a hostile world. The monsters remained the enemy of mankind, the infantry of an old war, and became inevitably the enemies of the one God. Tolkien goes on for a bit, kind of unpacking how the myth of Christianity is at odds with the myth of Norse Ragnarok. In the Christian myth, the victory is assured. Everybody wins if they're on the side of the one God. The Christian myth says, chill out. None of this really matters. Victory is assured. We just need to do our best in the meantime and everything will work out. But the truth is, for many people, that doesn't really describe how it feels to struggle and lose in a world filled with evil and heartbreak and regret and loss. So Tolkien goes on to develop this next point. We get, in fact, a poem from a pregnant moment of poise, looking back into the pit by a man learned in the old tales who is struggling, as it were, to get a general view of them all, perceiving their common tragedy of inevitable ruin, and yet feeling this more poetically, because he was himself removed from all the direct pressure of its despair. Tolkien is saying that the author of Beowulf was a Christian and therefore should not have felt subject or clutched in despair about their immortal soul, or the fear of death, or the triumph of good over evil. All of those things were assured and certain in the myth that they apparently believed. But he also says that the author finds poetry and truth and movement of the heart in contemplating that most simple observed truth in life, that we die and evil persists. But even in the face of that mortality, that futility, it is better to fight and die than to give in. Or as Tolkien puts it, the shadow of its despair, if only as a mood, is an intense emotion of regret, is still there. The worth of defeated valor in this world is deeply felt. So while monsters in a game are unnecessary obstacles, monsters in stories are about unavoidable obstacles, and indeed insurmountable obstacles sometimes. Grendel is that niggling thought that even in your happiest moment, you fear it will all amount to nothing, that you will fade and your life doesn't matter, that your fortunes are uncertain, and that happiness is only ever a fleeting escape from the inevitability of despair, that the chaos of nature and the evil in men's hearts can ruin any joy that you can celebrate. And in fact, sometimes evil targets you simply because you are celebrating the joy in your life. That is the metaphor of the monster. What then say we of the hero, of Beowulf? The metaphor of the hero delivers this thesis that it is better, more beautiful to struggle, more valorous to fight in the face of inevitability than it is to give in to despair. That the contest against the uncaring universe is worthy. That the joys that we celebrate and fight for, though bittersweet in the face of inevitable cosmic erasure, are still sweet indeed. And heroic fiction and fantasy and myth are painting on this canvas that is held in the tension between meaning and obliteration, of daring to risk, daring to live. So when we are playing Dungeons and Dragons and we pretend to stare into the beady eyes of that manticore, we are asking the question that inoculates us against nihilism, against despair. We roll that dice to ask simply, to be or not to be. Hot diggity! Natural 20 in your face, Death! All right, I think that's just about enough of that. Boy, that was a lot of fun, but that one got away from me a little bit. Now, it does bear mentioning that not every monster in every single story is attached to the same metaphor, the same meaning. That's the fun part about the imprecision of symbols, is that you can make your case to make things mean whatever you want by rearranging the symbols and putting them in conversations in proximity with other concepts. Ghost stories are going to be different than Frankenstein's monster, are going to be different than Cthulhu, but all of these are about fears and anxieties in some way, but I think the kind of combat and fight that happens in Dungeons & Dragons is really well addressed with the metaphors of Beowulf. Hey, if you know what I'm talking about, if you have felt that simulated thrill between life and death, tell me about it in the comments. What were these slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that you bore arms against and succeeded over? And while you're all scrolling down to check out all these amazing tales of daring do in the comment section, be sure to check out the resources I have listed in the description below, and maybe swing by my Patreon, where for just $5 a month, you get access to my secret sketchbook, where I talk about the artistic process behind all of these illustrations that I have been working on for Monstrous. And if you like my gestures at sounding academic and pedantic when talking about Dungeons & Dragons, I gotta imagine that you will love to see me doing that, even more so about art history topics and art composition from classical paintings in that Patreon post. And even if you're not able to support the channel in that way, I just want to thank you so much for watching, and until next time, my friends, farewell.